Okay, now that I got everything sorted, welcome to Building Rates and Pricing Strategies for solopreneurs, independent consultants, executive coaches, financial planners, whatever your profession is. We're going to cover the who, what, where, why, and when of billing, and it's not very straightforward. Parts of it are, but it does get more complicated. Sometimes people take this workshop more than once. They take it when they're just starting out and they get their foundation, and then a year or two later they come back and they're like, yeah, what were you talking about with that hybrid thing? Because as your service offerings change, so do your billing rates and pricing structures. So some quick housekeeping items. I will definitely be sharing the slides and link in any links or anything else that's referenced in the follow-up notes, which will probably go out by end of day tomorrow. I fly solo when I lead these workshops, so that means you need to handle your own background noise, mute, unmute. It's easier for me if you just raise your hand or interrupt me than for me to go find the chat button. Because even though I'm using literally 3 screens, it's still only one cursor and I'm easily confused. So please just speak up and make this as interactive as possible. I already mentioned we're going to cover all the who, what, where, why, and whens, but the general flow is like in most PICA workshops, most core workshops, we do introductions. And so we are going to do that. It's one of the ways that we build a community and help you expand your network. We're going to talk about types of billing rates, factors that impact pricing, do a little bit of benchmarking, and talk about the all-important quoting with confidence. But like I said, let's make this as interactive as possible. Let's start actually with introductions, and I'm going to introduce myself first because we actually have a couple of guests, and one I've met and one I haven't, so I will do my introduction. Obviously, I'm Liz Stebley. I'm one of the 3 solopreneurs who created PICA. It's that educational organization community where you can get the help you need to launch and grow your own business. I fell into independent consulting in 2004, never looked back. I made more money, worked fewer hours, had more quality time with my kid, lowered my effective tax rate, and said, oh, this is great. Everybody should be doing this. But of course, it's not quite that simple. 5 years after being a solopreneur, independent consultant, I started my first business, which is how I earn my living. It's called the ProCo Agency. And it's a matchmaking agency for self-employed consultants who specialize in organizational effectiveness, and we handle their contracts with Fortune 500 companies. As a result of growing that business, ProCo, into a multi-million-dollar business, I kept getting asked out to coffee a lot because people had a lot of questions about being self-employed, and that's when I got the idea for PICA. So it was really to help me avoid drinking a lot of coffee that all of the resources and webinars and now book all exist. It was for me to be able to help and reach more people. I'm based in Reno, Nevada, having fled California state income tax about 4 years ago. And that's it about me. Now, about you. We do this for 2 reasons. One is to give you the practice of introducing yourself in a succinct way. If you have not yet taken the Branding to Build Your Business workshop or the Know Your Niche, sometimes we call it Know Your Niche workshop, it's harder to be succinct, but still we all need the practice. And the second reason is so that you can expand your networks, because you never know where your next lead is going to come from. When you get the notes to this workshop at the bottom, there'll be all of your names of those of you who participated live and links to your LinkedIn profiles. And I encourage you to connect on LinkedIn because it has happened that PICA people have referred work back and forth to each other. Not guaranteeing, but it does happen. There's also something called the power of weak ties, meaning that you're more likely at some point you will mostly tap out your existing network, and you never know where your next lead is going to come from the weak tie, the new tie. So that's why we do this. All right, so with that, let's get started. And of course, we start right away with our guest, Chris. Nothing like making you go first.
No worries. So
But
my
you,
name is Chris Lele, and I'm joining from Walnut Creek. My consulting specialty is AI training coach. And how do I currently price my services? I'm starting off right now, and I'm even trying to find my exact marketing segment. So things are a little bit all over the place, but one thing that has been constant so far is that I am charging an hourly rate. And this is something that I put up on a website that I created.
okay. That's how most people start because it's the safest, it's the easiest to figure out, it's the easiest for clients to understand. So we'll cover details around that too. Thanks, Chris.
Great.
Connie is here, but not on camera because she's still finishing her lunch. But Connie, can you speak to introduce
Yeah,
yourself?
I'm done with my lunch. I'm
Okay,
back.
great.
So, hi everybody. I'm Connie Rawson. I'm based in San Francisco. I am a leadership coach specializing in working with leaders that are navigating significant change, anywhere from starting a new job at a new company or going through merger and acquisition. I price my services in as a package, but I back into it based on an hourly rate. And so far that's working, but I definitely need some help in simplifying what I'm doing.
No, it's important to have it tied back to the hourly rate because it's a sort of like a benchmark for everything else. Thanks, Connie. Denise isn't here live. Ebony is, but I don't know if she's ready or he or she is ready to come off of camera and or introduce himself by voice.
I'm here. I'm not sure if you can see me.
Oh, yes, there you are.
Great. Hello, everyone. My name is Ebony Bledsoe. I am a strategy and management consultant, but I'm also an astrologer, hypnotist, and tarot reader. So I use ancient wisdom combined with traditional business insights to support clients. And I'm based in Raleigh, North Carolina. I do strategy, transformation, and innovation. So I would say those are my 3 words. And currently, I price my services. So I've been working through as a subcontractor pricing hourly, but now I'm trying to transition away from that into doing value-based pricing.
Great. Thank you. Nice to see you and meet you. I don't think Jane is here. Neither is Joe. Neither is Kelly. Paula is here, though.
Oh, I thought I saw Kelly.
Oh, yeah, no, Kelly is here. I just didn't see you on screen.
It's okay. Paula can go first.
No, there you go. Too late now.
Okay. I'm Kelly Morris. I am joining from California Bay Area, and my specialty is compassionate leadership programs. Currently I have package pricing for the different programs that I offer, as well as the products that I offer.
Great. Thanks, Kelly. Sorry about that.
Oh, no worries.
All right, Paula, now your turn.
Hi, I'm Paula Schmidlin. I'm calling in from Oakland, California, and I am an organization change consultant and coach, and I'm just starting out, so I don't know what to price yet. So
That's why you're here.
I'm here.
Thanks. But on the other end, we have Steve, who has been independent for a while. Steve, it's your turn. As he looks for the mute button. There you go.
Yeah, sorry, it moved on me. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm one of those returners. I went through this a while back and am back as things have changed for me, just wanting to get other inputs if I can. So my name is Steve Delph, sunny Burbank, California, because I love to pay state taxes. I'm going to stick to it's 3.2 words, organizational and leadership transformation.
Excellent.
And my current pricing is, some of it is hourly, but I'm finding that there's a range of what people are wanting to pay for, and that's usually for like change management, project management kind of services that I've been doing. And then I do it by engagement for my executive coaching and facilitation, like workshop facilitation. I'm finding that the whole coaching industry, and I'd love anybody else who's doing that, it seems to have moved away from this hourly concept to more of an engagement.
Yes, or package. Yeah.
Yeah.
We'll talk about it. Great. Thanks, Steve. Nice to see you.
You too.
All right. Well, let's get into it. We're going to talk about the most common billing rates first before we get into any of the more bizarre combinations. So time and expense and or fixed fee project pricing, or by the engagement, it's a term I heard some of you guys use. I have value pricing and retainers here in quotes or in parentheses because they're not as common, but we will touch on them a little bit anyway. So first, let's start at the very beginning, the basics, that billing on time and expense, whether this is a day rate or an hourly rate, concepts are the same. There's some nuances between hourly versus daily, but most consultants, especially when they're just starting out, tend to use an hourly rate, as I said, because it's the easiest to figure out and there's less risk of undercharging, particularly if the work takes longer than you think it's going to. And when you're just starting out, sometimes you're not so good at estimating the level of work. So that's why it's safest to do either hourly rate or day rate when you're just starting out. Some people prefer doing a day rate because it's easier from an administration perspective. And there's also a way to sort of give a client a discount with a day rate, right? So if you were charging $200 an hour, instead of charging him $1,600 a day for 8 hours, you might charge him $1,500 a day. So that gives the client a little bit of an incentive to just say, okay, let's use a day rate, so you don't have to track your time in 10 or 15-minute intervals. Some other experts suggest that if you use a day rate as your starting point for all other rates, that if you only bill a half a day, that you charge a little more for that, because the likelihood of you selling the other half a day is very slim. So on the one hand, if you use a day rate, you might give a little bit of discount, but if you're charging only a half a day, you might actually charge a little more, maybe 60% instead of 50%, because you might not be able to fill the other half of your time. So there's no hard and fast rule. It's sort of what the nature of the engagement is and what you're comfortable with. What you're comfortable with is the most important thing. And we're going to talk about how to get more comfortable and confident with your rate. But let's talk a little bit about how to come up with what I call your base rate. And this
Hey,
is
Liz,
yeah, Steve?
sorry, I'm going to interrupt. You mentioned European client. Can you talk a little bit to that?
Yeah, I don't have personal experience with this, but a PICA member said that he does a lot of work with European clients, and they're used to day rates versus hourly.
Oh, so it has nothing to do with the time zone difference so much as just culture.
Practice and culture. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And speaking of, it's the same person actually. He always uses a day rate because he hates tracking his time in just small increments, drives him nuts. And he feels that if a client reaches out to him and he answers an email and it's not a day that he's working for that client, he doesn't care. He's just like, whatever. Right. So he says it kind of helps them feel like he's available more. And when I said it kind of depends on the type of work, particularly if you're doing like an interim leadership role or a fractional head of HR or something, like it's not full-time work, you could say, okay, well, I'll give, let's count on 2 days a week. It'll be $2,000 a day, so $4,000 a week. And it's just easier math than saying, okay, I'm going to give you 20 hours a week in bits and pieces all over the place, like 2 hours on Monday and 4 hours on Tuesday, and right, tracking every single interaction just gets to be a little bit cumbersome. So if you're going to do any fractional work or interim work and it's not full-time, use a day rate. Even if it is full-time, you might want to use a day rate. So that's sort of what I meant by type of work. Same thing with facilitation, right? If it's going to be you're going to go facilitate even a half-day workshop, it's going to take you a whole day to do it. By the time you get there, you facilitate it, you wrap up, you do the follow-up, whatever. It's a day. It's a lot easier than doing it by the hour. Any other questions or comments? Okay. All right, so let's talk about what I was estimating your base rate. And the reason I call it your base rate is because by having by triangulating on a range of numbers, you're going to know that that's your building block for everything else, whether it's going to be a coaching program or it's going to be a facilitation program or a fixed fee is for assessment work or whatever. Then it's just easier to compare apples to apples. Like you're like, okay, so how much did I make on that facilitation thing I did for company A, but then I did that small consulting project for company B, right? But one was charged as a fixed rate, one was charged as an hourly rate. It's just easier to break it all down to hourly so you can know where your profitability is. I call this the 2x, 3x estimate because you'll come up with a range of rates, as it shows here. Is you take your annual compensation when you were a full-time employee, or do a Google search on what a full-time employee would be making for the type of work that you'll be doing. Divide by 2,000, which is roughly the number of working hours a year, excluding vacations. And you'll get a number. In this case, in my example here, it's $75. I don't know any solopreneurs who should be charging $75 because you can't make a living in this world on $75. I don't care what type of work you're doing. That's why you need to multiply it by times 2, 2.5, and or 3 to come up with that range. You need to cover things like your business expenses, your insurance, your internet, your website, your business development time, the time you spent invoicing, all that sort of thing, plus your self-employment tax, right? Because when you're an employee, they pay half of your Social Security and Medicare, but now you have to pay that, and your vacation time. So, you know, all of those things that are not billable, you have to get compensated for. So that's why you need to inflate the rate by anywhere from 2 to 3 times. The other benefit of doing it this way, the 2x, 3x estimate, is that then you have the range. And I highly recommend quoting a range. If you're going to quote by the hour or even a day, I would quote a range, because there's something known as the center stage effect in psychology. People have 3 choices, they gravitate toward the middle. Or even if they have 5 choices, they gravitate toward the middle. So if you say my rate ranges between 165 and 220, or 185 and 225 an hour, they're going to gravitate? No. Navigate? No. What am I trying to say? Gravitate to 200. They gravitate to the middle. So I did that successfully for years. I'd be in an intake meeting and they'd say, Dot, this is great. It sounds just like the person, the person that we need for the job. What's your billing rate? And I'd say my rate ranges from 185 to 225 an hour based on the scope, duration, and complexity of the work. I just began to understand what the scope, duration, and complexity of the work is here. Let me get back to you tomorrow with what I would do, how I would tackle this, how I would chunk up the phases, and what I think a fair rate would be. I nearly always got $200, which was what I wanted. It was the middle of the range. No clients ever thought that they should be at the bottom. Not once in 15 years did a client say, oh, well, if your rate ranges from 185, we're going to pay you 185. Never happened. Every client thinks that their situation is more difficult, more complicated, more complex. If it wasn't, why are they calling you in the first place? So, yeah, only once did I get the high end of my range, but that's a story for another slide. Okay, any questions about this? Oh, I didn't talk about your market rate. So if you have subcontracted through an agency, and Ebony, I know you mentioned this, you can take whatever you were paid and multiply it times, I would even say 0.25 to 1.5. If it was through a platform like Catalan, this slide says 20%, but now I've heard they've raised their markups to 25%. That's what the client paid for you. If it was through an agency, the agency average is 35% markup, somewhere as high as 50. But if you run those numbers, that'll give you an idea of what you were paid, add that much, that's what the client paid for you. So that's a good data point too. The reason why earlier I said triangulate on a rate is because the more research you do, the more numbers you come up with, the more confident you are in whatever that range turns out to be. Because you did it this way and it came out to that, and you did it this way and it came out here. It's like a scatter diagram almost, right? You'll start to see the numbers all sort of clumping together. And you're like, okay, yeah, this makes sense. It's way better than pulling a number out of thin air and just saying, oh, my rate is 180 an hour. You have to have the confidence and know why. So that's why the idea of a market rate is on here too. Or even if you haven't subcontracted, but you know somebody else who has, ask them what they were paid and then do the math. The salary calculator's on here in case you were either underpaid at a full-time job, if you just left a full-time job, or if you've been out on your own for a while And you're like, wow, what, if I was internal as a digital marketing analyst, what would the salary be? You can use the salary calculator, but those rates are always low.
Hey Liz, it's Steve again.
Mhm.
I'll just add a comment about the subcontracting. Gosh, several years ago, 2019, I did some work, change management, for a company, and it was subcontracted. And finished the engagement. I had no idea what the rate was that was being charged to the company. I know what rate I was getting. And they've recently asked me to come back to do, I've stayed in touch with some people as an executive coach. So different probably model, but they sort of started out by saying, oh, and we know you're already in our vendor system. And I'm like, you know what? I'm probably not, because I was subcontracted. And that got me thinking, like, they've actually never really had executive coaches before. So I'm going to be introducing, probably their first pricing. I mean, the person I'm working with, who's the leader of HR, has never done it, has never worked with an executive coach, hired one for one of their clients. So I did reach out to the person who subcontracted me, and he gave me kind of a very general answer. So I think this is probably really helpful to get an idea, and it's a little different than what he told me. So that'll help give me a better range, I think.
Good. Yes.
But just kind of interesting the way that happened. I never even thought about that before.
Yeah, well, you know what you're paid, but you don't know what the client's paid, and
Right.
that's what you are worth because they've already paid it.
Exactly.
But now you're talking two different types of work though, because executive coaches tend to be paid better than people who do change management work.
Well, there's that, but I know that they probably know what they were paying for me.
Oh, right. As a
And
as a
so
benchmark for them.
I feel like they'll probably bring that information into it. And while I'll sell them the fact that, one, it's several years later, but it's
Yes,
also different types of services, it gives me a better idea of like kind of maybe where they're coming from.
yes.
You
Several years later, different types of services, and there's been significant inflation since 2019.
all excellent points
Yes. We will talk about
that I will be making.
We will talk about coaching pricing for coaching packages too later on.
Great,
There's
thank you.
a little bit of benchmarking towards the end. Okay, any other questions on the what I call the base rate? So let's talk about some variations. So the blended rate is what I did for years and years and years when I was a change management consultant. I knew that I was being underpaid at the beginning of a project when I was doing more of the diagnostics. I cannot talk today. The diagnostics, assessment work, and strategy work and planning. But I was being grossly overpaid at the end when I was trying to figure out who had done the required training and who had not, right? You can hire a temp to do that work. But it's too difficult to explain to a client why I'm going to charge $275 for the first 3 months, and then $200 for the middle 3 months, and then $150 for the last 3 months. So to me, it was a blended rate across the whole life cycle of the project. I do have a colleague friend who charges a split rate, different rates if it's on-site or off-site. Granted, this was before COVID, and the client was Nike. Was a very in-person client. Things have shifted a little bit since COVID, obviously, but she had small kids at home and she did not like being on the road. And so she gave them a $50 an hour incentive to let her work remotely instead of being on site 4 days a week. And it was enough that they said, oh, yeah, okay, this will work. So if you want to incentivize a certain behavior by a client, you can use your billing rate and have split rates for that. On-site, off-site is a very clear thing to tell the difference. Travel rate, if you don't ask, you don't get. I always say you should ask for a travel rate because worst thing that can happen is they say, no, we have a policy against paying for travel. Usually it's if it's more than 100 miles by car or 2 hours by air or whatever the phrasing is, put it in your statement of work as, or your estimate as billable time, but at a fraction of what your full-time rate would be. This is time that you're not spending with your family, or more importantly, or maybe not more importantly, but you're not spending it with another client either. And if they say, well, it's, we don't usually pay for travel time, you're like, well, gee, that's time that I could have been spending with my other client. If they're hiring you for full-time work, that argument is harder to fly. All right, monthly rates. Okay, that's obviously a variation of hourly or daily times whatever days of the month. But in my experience, monthly rates are very tricky. Definitely depends on the type of work. And this is the same is true for fixed fee or project pricing. If the greater the degree of control that you have over maintaining the timeline and the deliverables and making things happen on time, then it makes more sense to go to a monthly or fixed fee. If you have very little control over meeting those deadlines and timelines, don't do it. Because, for example, I used to do change management work on big, hairy tech projects, implementing things like SAP, Oracle on a global basis. I had no control over those project life cycles. There was always the testing cycle didn't work and it's going to be pushed back, or there's always some sort of a crisis. There was one time when Clorox wanted to hire me to do the organizational change strategy work for implementing the HR module of SAP. And they said, well, listen, we really would like to have consistent control over our budget. Would you consider a monthly rate of $24,000 a month? I said, I can do no math in my head whatsoever. And I said, oh, I've never done a monthly rate. Can I get back to you about this? I'll get back to you tomorrow. And they're like, yeah. All right. So I whip open my Excel spreadsheet or my calculator or whatever, and I figure it out. I'm like, oh, yeah, I can live on $24,000 a month. Duh. So I said, yes. Okay. But then sure enough, partway through that project, I was working 60 hours a week, turned into, project from hell, as most of those SAP projects do. And I made the mistake of calculating my hourly rate based on 60 hours a week. And it was way below my minimum. And then from that point on, I had a chip on my shoulder and I was not happy. It was very hard for me to bring my best self and do my best work when I was being paid, in my mind, peanuts. But it was my mistake for accepting the monthly rate. So that's what I learned from my mistake. Don't just say, oh yeah, $24,000 a month is good. Because nothing was in my control. And then all of a sudden I'm working 60 hours a week. And yeah, that didn't work out well for me. And then a PICA member said that if you're working remotely, it's more likely to work in your favor if you have just like a monthly rate. And I think maybe that's because you have more control of your time. You're not pulled into side meetings or those conversations in the hallway, or, hey, Paula, you got a minute? The next thing you know, 25 minutes later. Maybe I think that's what was behind the remote work. It's not as dangerous to do a monthly fee. Retainer, we always use the term retainer, but really what it is a stipend, right? It's an upfront payment to access your smarts and be on call for a certain number of hours a month. Retainers are great when you can get it. However, you will almost always need to have a pre-existing relationship with the client, because it takes a lot of trust on their part that they're going to get their money's worth. If they're going to hire Chris for 10 grand a month, they need to make sure that they're going to get their 10 grand a month worth out of him. And usually people, I don't know if this is a phrase, I was going to say mature into a retainer. So I represent a consultant through my other business. He's been doing work with Franklin Templeton Investments for about 4 years. The first 2-3 years, it was all hourly. And now they just want him on call. They're like, we love him. We just want to be able to pull him in when we need to. So we're moving him to a retainer. And it's just easier for everybody. Everybody's happy with it. So
Can I add something there too?
of course.
So I've had one client for about 7 years now, and it actually evolved from you actually were really helpful with me making this transition, but I went from being a contracted through a consulting company where I did know my billable rate, but also those two entities decided to part ways, but both sort of gave me permission to pursue working with them individually. And so I was able, initially the next year I sort of honored the consulting company's approach, which was here's a engagement package for what we'll do. But after that, the challenge with that, I'm sorry, I don't mean to drag this out, is the nature of the work I do is not consistent throughout the year, and there are ebbs and flows, which one makes it kind of challenging. You know, I have to do other work around it, right? And sometimes I can, and sometimes I can't as much. And it's also means that my cash flow is not as consistent. And then the argument that I made to the company also was that their cash flow wasn't as consistent. Not that I'm a big bucket or anything, but some months they were paying me much larger sums than others. And so once, I would say for the last 5 years, I have had a retainer, and we've just sort of adjusted it based on how they want me to do the work differently. But I'm able to say, I know I'm working about this many hours for you over the course of the year, and let's spread it out evenly over those 12 months, which is much better for me from a budget maintenance and everything. So I wish I could find more like that for sure.
But again, you took the existing relationship and matured it into something more
Right. And
stable.
I was also fortunate in that I did know the billable rate. I knew what I was getting paid. And so I could just sort of slide right in and make the full rate, which was nice, right? Because they were willing to pay it before. It's just now they're paying it directly to me. But yeah, so that was one great thing. But then yeah, it took a couple of years, and then we all just sort of agreed, doesn't it make more sense? We know I'm doing the same work for you year in, year out. I know how much time I'm spending doing that. I do actually track it for them. One of the things I'm doing for them is a business tracker for their company. So I'm practicing it on myself, and it allows me to give them an example of, see, here's what I'm doing. But yeah, it took a couple years, but it's great if you can get it, I think.
Yes, once you get there.
And you know that there aren't going to be, and one of the conditions is, unless something changes, and then here's my hourly rate for additional work above and beyond the scope of what we've agreed to. Is that right?
Yes.
Makes sense? Yeah. Just thought I'd share.
It's nice to know that it is possible.
Yeah.
It's one thing I do want to cover here that was added, squeezed onto this slide actually, was this concept of the Colorado pricing. I didn't invent this term, neither did the person who wrote the blog about it. And the title on this slide is linked to the actual blog. So this was by a blog written by David A. Fields, who was one of my favorite consulting gurus. And basically, Colorado pricing isn't a payment mechanism, but it's an approach to setting fees for consulting work that produces output. So in other words, while the payment mechanism might be $10,000 a month, you're backing into it because that's the budget they have. So basically what he says is you're working it backwards. We're like, okay, there's a ton of work here, and I would love to support you, and there are going to be ebbs and flows, but what we can do is take what your budget is, and then I can tell you what the scope can be to fit that budget. So instead of starting with scope, you're starting with budget, and then you're backing into what can squeeze into that, how much work you can squeeze into that budget, basically. So it's a flipping it a little bit, how you're approaching the fees. It's based more on what they can afford. They know they want you, they know there's a ton of work, they trust you, and okay, we're gonna hire Paula for 10 grand a month, and Paula says, month 1 I'm gonna do this, month 2 I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna reevaluate, then I'll come back to you and let you know what month 3, 4, and 5 are gonna look like, or whatever. But again, it gives consistent cash flow for you, consistent cash flow for them. PICA member Mark Smutney, who does a lot of work with nonprofits, says this idea, this Colorado pricing, works brilliantly well in nonprofits because they have notoriously tight budgets. So Anyway, I am not the expert on Colorado pricing, hence the link to the article. Any questions? Did I just skip a slide? No, I didn't. Okay. So let's talk about fixed fee pricing. The older I get and the more consultants I talk to, the more I become a fan of fixed fee pricing, because you are getting paid for your intellectual property. And what do I mean by that? So let's say that Steve has done change management assessments, or let's just focus it on stakeholder readiness assessments, right? He's done it like 12 times in the last 5 years, knows exactly how long it's going to take, or maybe not exactly, but he knows it's going to take roughly 30 to 40 hours. I'm totally making this up. But each time he does one, he does it a little bit faster because he's got the tools and he's got the templates and he's got, now he's using AI to do the survey analysis, whatever. So he's not spending as much time. If he's billing by the hour, he's going to make less money because it's not taking him as many hours. But if he says, okay, I can do a stakeholder assessment in 30 hours, and he figures out what his hourly rate is times 30, and he charges that, every time he does it and gets faster and faster and faster, he's still getting paid for his intellectual property, and as if it was taking him 30 hours. I hope I did a good job of explaining this, but it's important. You work faster, and if you bill by the hour, you get paid less because it takes you less time. And fixed fee is a way to take care of that. So how does it really work? The premise, of course, is you get paid for the hours it should take, not what it actually takes. And that's how you end up increasing your compensation on an hourly basis. The precursor, of course, is you have to know. You have to have a good idea of how long it takes to do a certain something, whether it's an assessment or stakeholder or focus groups or whatever the heck. Like Chris, maybe in your line of work, there's like a basic training you do for AI prompts, right? That would be a good excuse to do a fixed fee for that. And when we'll talk about hybrid rates, but let's let the cat out of the bag now. It's wonderful when you can even do this within the same contract. You can say, okay, well, I can do this one piece as a fixed price of $15K, and then for each additional hour of coaching or consulting work on the project, that'll be billed at $225 an hour. So it doesn't have to be the whole project that you need to do a fixed fee. It can just be a piece of it. And a lot of people don't think of that. They think, oh, I'm going to need to price this whole thing either package price or the whole thing be an hourly rate. And no, you can mix it up and make a little extra money in the process. I'm not going to talk through the math on this slide because seriously, I am so bad at math. Even reading the slide, I can't do it right. But basically, instead of charging $200 an hour, you would end up making $300 an hour if you base it on what it should take, not what it actually takes. The one thing is you do need to include the contract that anything outside of the predetermined scope is billed at a certain hourly rate, which should be normal, which should be maybe even an uplift of your current hourly rate. And that's particularly useful if there's a certain number or quantifiable things. Like, let's say you're going to do a stakeholder assessment and you're like, okay, I'm going to interview the 6 VPs and the 10 senior directors to come up with the stakeholder assessment. But then all of a sudden they say, oh, well, we also want you to interview the directors. That's another 10 people. Well, that's a whole lot more work and time. So that's when you would need to say, well, that's more than what we had negotiated for in our contract. Should we have a conversation about doing a change order so I can bring those people in? Not, I can just do that one, those by the hour. So that's the tricky part about fixed fees. You need to have pretty clear scope. But remember, it goes back to what I said before. If things aren't in your hand, in your control, don't do fixed fee. It works really, really well for short things. Like I'm going to do 10 focus groups over 2 weeks. Great. Very contained scope. I'm going to do a 1 day offsite. It's going to take me half a day to prep, half a day to wrap up. So I'm gonna charge you for 2 days, fixed fee will be this. But when you start getting into more nebulous things like, we have a high degree of employee turnover, we're not quite sure why or how to fix it. Yeah, there's way too many variables to do fixed fee there. Any questions before I flip and talk about package pricing, which is similar but different? Okay, I don't see anybody raising their hands. Okay, so let's talk about the package pricing. And this is sort of a combination of fixed fee and what I talked about earlier about using a range of rates or that center stage effect where people gravitate towards the middle. You can do this even in more complicated consulting scenarios where you could say, wow, so you've got this employee turnover problem based on what this conversation that we just had. I would recommend, well, I would always do the proposal the next day. I would never do it live on the fly. But anyway, based on what, I understand of your situation, if you really wanted to address the root cause and let's set yourself up for future success and, make sure everything is locked and loaded and all the T's crossed, I would recommend this package A. But, maybe that's more than you want to take on right now, both in terms of time or resources or bandwidth, whatever, to really just address that one issue, you can do package B. Or if you really just want to stop people from running for the exits, do the bare minimum C. 9 times out of 10, the client will gravitate towards package B. So it's even within, we do it in my other business, we do it sometimes within the same proposal. We'll say, okay, this is our understanding of the work. This is how we would approach the work. Here's option A. You do items, 1 through 10, or option B, you only do these options, or we don't recommend this, but if it really budget's an issue, just do these 5 things.
Liz, what about a situation where, they're not entirely sure? You're really going in to do some assessment and trying to figure out what the issue is because they're not even sure. Would you ever, I think this is probably a good approach, but it might even be separate packages, right? Like the first one is, we're just going to come in and do some assessment to be able to even give you
Yes.
a proposal, right?
Yes, because a lot of times things are so confusing or convoluted, and you can't read the tea leaves, right? Let me just get in there, do a baseline assessment, understand what the current state is. I can do that probably 2.5 days a week, take me about 4 weeks, $25,000. Then we'll have an idea of what the priority should be and how to structure the rest of the work, which I may or may not be the right person for, and we can talk about pricing then.
And do you find that, do they want some idea? It's hard to do that, but you're asking them to make a commitment without, necessarily solving the problem, just identifying the problem, right?
Yeah. So
I'm sort of answering my own question.
You could also, if you look at it from the other point of view, the other frame of reference, from their frame of reference, you're like, listen, I could give you a proposal to address this problem, soup to nuts, but I don't know what that's going to take because I don't know. We haven't really looked under the hood. We don't really know what's wrong, where the problem is. And so I feel like I would be doing you a disservice if I said, oh yeah, I can take care of all of this in 6 months at an hourly rate of $225 an hour and throw some big number out there, but we don't know what we don't know. So let's just focus on this initial diagnostic and assessment work and really understand what we're dealing with.
I think I don't know if this is, well, it doesn't necessarily work for me, but I think there's a number of situations where potential clients are just like, what would you charge? And I wonder if I could get away with some huge astronomical number because they don't know. And you're not necessarily going to solve it for them, but it certainly leads to a lucrative engagement. I just don't know that I think that probably happens a lot, to be honest, because where I have had a situation just earlier this year where I'm like, I can't give you an estimate because you can't tell me what you're looking for. You know, I would need to talk to some stakeholders, get a sense of what the situation is, you know, and I never heard from them again. So something tells me they went with somebody who's just like, sure, $50,000, you know?
Yeah, but you could do that, but
I know.
it's super risky. Then you're going basically to a fixed fee or monthly retainer,
Right.
whatever, without knowing what the scope is and what's in
Yeah.
your hands to control. And you've never worked with the client before. You don't know if they're responsive or if they keep putting people off or if they cancel their meetings at the last minute, or you don't know what a pain in the ass they might be.
Yeah.
So
I think
you might have dodged a bullet, frankly.
No, I think I did, but I think the root cause drew my attention because there's a lot of people I think that are just looking for symptoms to be addressed, right? So
that's when they go with package C. They're like, okay, yeah, let's just
Right.
take care of the symptom.
Right. Good point. Okay, thank you.
The last thing I want to say about the package pricing is if you tend to be an A+ person who goes above and beyond, you know, you like to overserve and clients has a problem, you're like, oh yeah, let me help you. This isn't probably not a good idea. Because scope creep shoots package pricing to bits, right? You have to really be able to manage the scope. So be careful of fixed fee or packages if you tend to be one of those people like, oh yeah, I can do that extra thing. You have to really be careful about that. Time is money. All right, so let's talk about value pricing and or hybrid models. I have these both on the same slide because in my experience talking with, advising and representing maybe 1,000 independent consultants over the years, I maybe know one that does value pricing. I mean, it's not common. And the reason that it's not very common is because it's hard to pinpoint what the results are. We have to have good metrics. The client has to do what you tell them to do, and you have to trust that they're measuring it the right way. I mean, there's just a whole lot of trust involved in value pricing. It also depends on the type of work, though. I mean, of course, the classic example is it's a manufacturing problem. They're, you know, they know they're losing money because their factory line is down on average of 5 hours a month, and you know how to fix it. Then yeah, you're going to save them a ton of money. And that's when value pricing comes into play because a fix is easily observable. But if it's something else that might play out over time, let's say like employee engagement or retention, it might take a year before they, you know, they have the results of whether what you recommended is working, whether or not it's working. And that's also a delayed payment. When you're self-employed, cash flow is everything. You need cash flow to pay your bills. You don't want to do the work now and be paid for it. What month are we in? May? You don't want to be paid for it next February or next May after they've had a year of implementing and understanding what the change is. So if you want to do value pricing, I strongly recommend a hybrid where you say, okay, normally I charge $400 an hour, but I understand their situation is whatever. Why don't we look at this a different way? Why don't I cut my rate in half at $200 an hour, but I'll take, you know, 1%, 1% bonus or whatever you call it, retainer. That's not a retainer, but I'll take 1%, we'll call it a bonus of your savings or, you know, increased revenue over the net, you know, at 6 months and 12 months. Because at least then you're getting paid at the beginning. You're getting something. And then there's more upside for more value that you can provide. I think that makes a lot more sense as a solopreneur than putting all of your eggs into this long-term basket, if that makes any sense. Some experts like Alan Weiss, whose book is on this linked to on this slide, says, you know, this is where the big bucks are and you're a fool if you're doing anything but value pricing. I strongly disagree. I think it depends on the type of work that you do. Very hard to measure like the effectiveness of it, very hard to measure if you have a good change management plan or not. You know, like, okay, we'll track the number of calls to the help desk, or we'll track if there's any downtime, but it's just hard to measure. So I don't think value pricing makes a lot of sense. And certain types of consulting work.
What about asking for a piece of equity in a startup or something? I mean, that's risky, but
It is risky, and I remember I was in consulting during the original dot-com boom of 2000. I would still do a hybrid.
yeah.
You still need at least, you just like, you're like, listen, I still have bills to pay. I fully believe in this company, love it that you've offered me equity, but I need to at least get paid something. And that's where and you know what, in that example I used earlier, I'm like, well, normally my rate's $400 an hour, but let's say for the, in exchange for equity, I could lower it to $200 an hour. Go with a very high number. When I said do that scattergram and figure out what your range of rates are, go even higher than what that range is. So my normal range of rate was at 185 to 225. Granted, this was 15 years ago, but okay. I would say, normally my rate's $300 an hour, but let's go down to $200 an hour, right? Which is what I really wanted anyway, because they don't know what your normal rate is. And, let's say in exchange for the equity or the bonus, whatever. The key thing, I'm going to talk about factors that impact pricing, but the key thing is to not quote in the moment if you can avoid it, and say, let me think about this. Let me think about how to approach this. Let me put together a proposal and get back to you tomorrow. Because then you can think about, is there an opportunity to do hybrid pricing somewhere? Can I do a chunk of this as fixed fee? Maybe I can get it, they're about to go public. Maybe I could get some friends and family stock or whatever. Then you have time to be more creative. Speaking of other considerations, don't use contingency fees. This is the same thing as hybrid or as value-based almost, but contingency, particularly like if you were a lawyer where you only get paid if you win the case, it's just too risky when you're self-employed. I don't advise it. Performance-based pricing is the same thing as value pricing. And I have this other thing here. What about paid by deliverable? This is not a pricing thing, but you will run into it when you're doing contracting. More and more clients want, if you're working with corporations, want to pay by deliverable or by milestone. And the reason is, from a legal perspective, it appears to mitigate the risk of you being misclassified as a contractor when the law says you should be an employee. If they pay you by the hour, it starts to mimic an employee-employer relationship, and clients don't like that. So they might insist that you are paid by milestone or deliverable. The answer is sure. But you still track your time and still base that on your base rate hourly or whatever. Your client is typically not the person in procurement or legal that's asking to be paid on by deliverable. And you have an agreement with them. You're like, okay, listen, my hourly rate's $200 an hour. But accounting really wants me to be paid by milestone or deliverable. So everything's just going to be based on multiples of 200. And then let's say that but you want to submit an invoice once a month. What we do on my other business is we'll say, invoice for May, 75% completion of deliverable A, $10,000. It doesn't even have to be 100% complete to be billed by deliverable, because accounting doesn't care. Accounting doesn't look, they don't know what the contracts are. So it's really just a semantics almost. More and more, I like it when clients want us to be paid by deliverable or milestone, because usually the consultant's been conservative in their level of effort and they do it faster than they think they were going to. We bill them for the whole amount. They do it in 20 hours, even though they estimated it would take 25 hours. We bill the client the 25 hours and we give the rest to the consultant. They're the ones that want us to bill by the milestone deliverable, so I don't feel bad doing it. So it's not really a pricing thing. It's more of an accounting thing. Any questions on this before we go into the factors that impact pricing? Not yet. Okay. All right. So two main things that impact pricing: your situation and the client's situation. Your situation doesn't change very often. So you probably only have to do this homework once, unless you move or you're doing a different type of work, whatever. So things that impact pricing that are personal to you, your geography, field of expertise, et cetera. I'm not going to go through this whole list, but the point is consultants in San Francisco and New York City can charge higher rates than consultants who live in Boise, Idaho. Just the way the world works. This is something to think about in your client situation too. Are they based in San Francisco or New York City? And you're based in Idaho? Well, maybe you want to charge a little more, quote a little bit higher rate, because they're going to be used to higher rates where their geography is. Your field of expertise, there's not a lot you can do about this. Your expertise is your expertise, but let's take Steve's world of change management, for example. In the world of change management, there are sub variations, right? There's instructional design, there's training or training development, there's stakeholder analysis, there's communications, there's training, there's a whole bunch of things in there. People that do training, instructional design get paid less than people who do communication strategy. People who do communication strategy get paid less than people who do the organizational change strategy. So there's a continuum, but only you know what that is for your area of expertise. Chris, for you, right? Nobody knows what the going rate is for AI coaches, consultants, whatever. So you get to just invent it when it comes to your expertise. And that's where confidence is going to be everything.
I was going to say a lot of confidence, especially if I go very high.
Yes, we're gonna talk about that too. Another thing is your experience, both in terms of the type of experience you've had and the total years of experience. If you have a company like McKinsey, BCG, Accenture, Deloitte on your resume, you can usually charge more, and you should. And market conditions and competition, this is a little bit harder to gauge, but if you can do like an internet search on AI consultant San Francisco Bay Area and see what comes up, I would imagine there's going to be a lot, fairly large number, but you get a sense of what the supply and demand might be out there. But if you did that same thing for, Austin, Texas, or Atlanta, Georgia, or whatever, different metros, you're going to get different demand and supply. I'm a huge fan about being professional, because I think the more you present yourself as a business, the more you can charge, as opposed to being a contractor or a freelancer or using a .gmail account. Instead, you have a name of a business, you get a logo, right? I think that counts for a lot. And we have a whole separate slide on confidence. So your situation probably doesn't change that much unless, you're moving from San Francisco to Reno, Nevada, like I did. In that case, I could get away with charging less, but did I? No, I kept my rates the same.
Hey, can I add one?
Mm-hmm.
I think is certificates or certifications.
Good point.
You mentioned change management. I changed my rate as soon as I got a ProSci, and I only got it because some people wanted it. I don't know that I learned a lot at this stage of my career,
right.
but I now can put it on. And I would say similarly, during the pandemic, for my own professional development, I got a coaching certification, and there are some companies are looking for pedigree, is what I call it.
Yes.
Right. And but that allows you, I think, to charge more.
I agree. I'm going to add it to the slide.
Oh, cool. Yay, I added it.
Thanks, Steve. But that doesn't mean if you don't have a certification that you should not charge very much either. So the reverse isn't necessarily true. All right, but this is the one page that when you get these slides, there might even be a cheat sheet on it in the follow-up notes. But this is the slide that you should look at every single time before you quote anything to a client. You need to slow down and review this. And this is based on my years of experience in all different industries and representing hundreds of consultants on various contracts. This is how it shakes out. First is their industry. If they are in high tech, biotech, life sciences, those are very high margin businesses. They are not rate sensitive, generally speaking. If they're a startup, it might be, but even startups in those industries are well funded. On the other hand, government, nonprofit, grocery business, very low margins, very tight budgets. They are going to be price sensitive. So that's the first thing to consider. Again, their size, Fortune 500 companies, they're used to hiring companies like, Accenture, McKinsey, Deloitte, consultants at $400 an hour. So factor that into your thinking too. If you focus on small to middle market companies, there are a lot that, if you quote $400 an hour, they're going to freak out. So that's another thing to consider. Most important is their alternatives and sense of urgency. So when you're in the initial conversation with them, or what I call the intake session, try to suss out, are they talking to somebody else, or do they have another consulting firm in there? In my line of work, which was change management, they always had another consulting firm in there doing the technical stuff. And so then I would know, I'm like, well, who are you, who's your systems integrator? And they'd say, oh, well, we're working with Capgemini. I'm like, okay. I said, I know Capgemini, I've worked with them before. They don't have a very big, deep bench when it comes to change management, but I know what they're used to charging, I said to myself. So I can raise my rate a little bit higher because I know who my competition is. The sense of urgency, this reminds me of the story I promised you earlier, where the one time I did get the high end of my range. So I was in a meeting with the program director, the HR representative, and I forget who else was in the room, and me. We were talking about, they were implementing SAP. They were partway through, 4 months into, like, say, a 12-month program. So they're like a third of the way into it. They hadn't done anything related to change management. And I turned and I looked to the program director and I said, I bet you got somebody coming by your office once or twice a week wondering if they're going to be layoffs, if they're going to still have a job. And he looked at me like I was walking on water. He's like, how did you know that? I said, well, because I've been doing this type of work a long time. And that's what people are thinking. That's what they're wondering about. And because you haven't done any change management. And then I showed them the 2 change management curves. I'm like, normally you would be here, but you're not. You're over here, blah, blah, blah. And he looked at me. He's like, oh, you're just, I can tell already you're the person that we need. And what do you charge and how soon can you start? And I said, my rate's $225 an hour and I can start on Monday. I can have an assessment done and plan ready for you in 3 weeks. It's like, great, let's do it. Okay, wonderful. I could sense it. In the moment I had a sense of urgency. So that was good. So I went straight to the top of my range. I didn't go through that normal quoting 185 to 225 an hour, blah, blah, blah. I didn't do anything. I just said 225, I can start Monday. He said, great. All right, I got the top end of my range. Yay, me. But no, not yay me. I could have gotten 275 an hour or 300 an hour if I had looked at the slide, or if I even had invented the slide and looked at it and realized they have no other alternatives. Their sense of urgency is sky high. They are a medical device company in a high margin business. They're working with, and actually that was Capgemini on that project. So they're used to higher rates. If I had paused and said, let me get back to you tomorrow, I could have made a lot more money. So don't quote in the minute, in the hour, in the meeting, whatever, if you can. Right? Learn from my mistake. So anyway, and then also if you pause and say, let me get back to you tomorrow with a proposal, or 2 days from now with a proposal, then you can also think, is there a piece of this that I can do as a fixed fee and go in with like a hybrid price that can do this piece for fixed fee and then the other work at an hourly rate. Learn from my mistakes, print this out, look at it every time. Don't quote in the meeting. This is how you get movement. Any questions before we go into a little bit of benchmarking?
Yes, I have a question. I'm meeting with the client tomorrow, actually, and a potential client, and he's not familiar with working with consultants at all, even though it's not a large company. But like, how do you support a client like that who's just has no clue like of what things should cost and timelines and things like that?
First, I would focus on their situation, ask a ton of questions, including the one, why now? Why are you looking to address this now? What's the urgency? Is the budget been pre-approved? Who needs to make the final decision on this? What's kept you from addressing this before? Right. So because all of that is going to give you clues into like what their sense of urgency is and everything else. And you could be asking point blank, I realize that you're a newer company or a smaller company or whatever. Have you ever worked with consultants before? And if so, is there a type of pricing that you prefer? Is it an hourly rate, day rate, or fixed fee? You'll learn something. They'll say, no, we've never hired a consultant before at all, ever. And then you're like, okay. Or they'll say, oh yeah, we did have somebody in here once and blah, blah, blah. But in any case, you'll learn something. And then say, well, let's just make sure that we're even in the same ballpark. My rate, I usually like to charge bill by the hour, and I will put together a proposal for you and let you know what I think it would take to address this problem, or at least this section of the problem. And I can get that to you in a couple of days. And then they'll say, well, or we might do this, but let's make sure that before I go and do all that work, let's make sure we're even in the same ballpark. I estimate that if I work on this full-time, it's going to cost you about $6,000 a week. If we do it part-time, obviously it'll be a lot less. Can your budget support $24,000 a month? And you might freak out, but I might say, no, that sounds reasonable. And even then you're not quoting an hourly rate though. Does that help?
Yes, definitely. I definitely didn't want to share an hourly rate with them.
Right. So just ask, or just ask them. Or you can also be even more vulnerable and candid and say, in addition to asking them, have you worked with consultants before and what type of rate do you prefer? You could say, listen, in the past, I've been doing this work for the last 5 years or 4 years, whatever, as a subcontractor through an agency. And now we're talking directly without the agency. So I'm not sure. I'm unfamiliar with how to approach this part. So can you help me out with what do you guys prefer?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you.
All right, so let's do some real quick benchmarking. Agency, we already talked about agency rates. If you've subcontracted through an agency, that's a really good benchmark. You can do a quick survey of fellow consultants that you know and say, send an email out to 5 people and say, hey, I know you work in change management. I think I'm undercharging. Have you raised your rates over the last few years? And if so, like by how much? And what sort of range of rates do you usually quote? If you don't mind my asking. And a lot of people will reply back. In the PICA community on LinkedIn, that's a safe space. Only PICA members are there. That's a great place to ask questions like this. Also do all kinds of searches on the internet and pretend you're a client looking to hire someone like you. You can go to a site like Upwork or Catalan and see if rates are posted. On Upwork, they are. Now, most people that are finding their work through Upwork are more like contractor freelancer types. They're not professional independent consultants. So I think all of the rates on Upwork are low, but at least you might find something. Chris, for you in particular, I'm like, I don't know. If I was a small business and I needed somebody to coach me on AI, I would go to look at Upwork. But all of those rates tend to be on the lower side, but still, it's a little bit like licking your finger and to see which way the wind is blowing, but it's better than nothing. Last, compared to other professional services like accounting, or even maybe not even professional services. In San Francisco, I used to spend $120 to get my hair cut. Okay, if a guy cutting my hair is making $120 an hour, surely me as a change management consultant should be making way more than that. Right? So look at the world around you. Everybody's charging more for everything these days. What do you pay your tax accountant? Is your expertise on par with theirs? Depends on the client situation, but could be. So let's look at some very broad benchmark numbers. This is not for IT or project management, training development, whatever. This is like management consulting. We've got a problem. We don't know what it is. We need a diagnostic. We need a recommendation and help to implement it. These numbers are over the last 20 years. Big firms, there's been a lot of pressure on rates. Big firms aren't getting the rates that they haven't been able to increase their rates the way they used to, and they've sort of stayed stagnant since pre-COVID. But this will give you an idea based on years of experience. This is what I'm saying. Like, I don't know any professional independent consultant who should be charging less than $100 an hour.
Liz, does that first bullet say for management consultant that's not IT, not project management, not training development?
Right. Which I know rules out a lot, I know. But change management consulting, leadership
Got it.
development,
Got it.
marketing strategy,
Got it.
I'm telling you, they're broad, but at least it gives you an idea that if you have over 15 years of experience and you were thinking of charging $150 an hour and you're a digital marketing consultant, yeah, probably not charging enough. I know a couple of you talked about executive coaching, so here's some ballpark numbers on that based from my other business from Proco, the one that pays me and makes money. Some sample package prices for corporate clients, both in New York and California. So, those are going to be higher than if the client was in Boise, but it's literally all over the map. But they do most coaches do tend to do packages either in, usually I see them in like 4 to 6 month ranges, because it takes time for people to observe their behavior, change their attitudes, change their practices, and see changes in their behavior. And I think that's why most coaches tend to do them as packages.
Liz, I have a question. So on the exec coaching front, so I've got some clients that are paying themselves and then others that are being paid through a corporation. And I think I kind of backed into a similar hourly rate, but I'm pricing for a 6-month engagement for a corporation. I think it's just it seems like an easier pill to swallow. And what I'll tell individuals is, change takes time, in order to grow in the way that you want to. And so I'll set an expectation of a minimum of 3 months, but kind of do more of a monthly, kind of quoting a monthly rate. I'm just curious how. I'm not sure that's the right thing. I'm just how I should think about pricing for individuals that are paying themselves.
Yes.
Because the work is the same for me. It's kind of more just the who's paying.
Yes. And the price points are going to be very different, right? Like you can get away maybe with a $20,000 package for Intel, but you're not going to get an individual to pay $20,000.
Right.
Yeah. The thing about package pricing though, too, and with coaching is you need people to commit.
Yep.
So even though you're not going to get the same rate as you would for billing the corporation for hiring you as a coach, you still want them to commit. I mean, you said that you set the expectation it's going to need to be at least 3 months, but I would say, I do it as a package. You can have, 3 months or 6 months or 3, 6, or 9. Maybe they gravitate towards the 6 for the center stage effect. But yeah, you can't, I'll charge them a little bit less.
Yeah.
And then you can do it. You can also do it. You could do, they're not going to pay you all at once, right? Because cash flow as an individual is a lot harder. So you could say, we can break this down. If I'm going to meet with you for, every other week, we can do a payment every other week, or whatever the cadence is of the actual coaching. That's what I did with my executive coach many years ago. It's like every time I met with her, I just brought a check.
Yeah. Okay.
But it wasn't hourly, it was a package.
Yeah. I'm still trying to kind of price it as a package because they may want me to review something in advance, or they may need a quick, what I call like a sprint call or something. And I want to support what they're trying to accomplish versus the hourly rate. And that's what I've done is if it's 3 months, pay half up front and halfway through. And then we schedule the second part of the sessions.
I see a lot more consultants and coaches now charging a down payment. Particularly with corporations with payment terms at net 45 or net 60, or even I've seen contracts with net 90, which I've always negotiated down. But yeah, you don't want to have to wait 60 days to start getting cash flow. So even consultants now are starting to say, okay, well, we're going to start with a initial down payment. I'm going to submit an invoice in the first 2 weeks just to get flush the water through the pipes and get the cash flow going. And clients always say yes.
Yep.
So I've had a couple coaching colleagues that advised me for a recent engagement that I had to do half down. on a 6-month engagement. And, I did it. It works.
It's easier with corporations than it is with
Yeah,
individuals,
I
though, for
did
sure.
that too, and that worked for a corporation.
Well, this was with a startup too, and sometimes they're still a little footloose and fancy free with their spending, or can be. But yeah, I mean, and I think that when I asked why, it was like sometimes people back out of the engagement or whatever, and you don't want to deal with the back end of trying to, get payment or honor an agreement, and it sort of makes people commit to it more if they've already paid for it.
That too.
I hadn't considered that, but yeah.
Particularly in coaching commitments, everything, right?
Yeah, right.
Okay.
I don't know that I would try it with the consulting yet, but maybe it'd be nice.
No, we're doing it more and more, an initial invoice after first 2 weeks, and then after that, we bill at the end of every month.
Interesting.
Because I don't know if it's almost every time, but for a new client, for sure, almost every time. It doesn't matter what the payment terms are, there's a holdup.
Yeah.
Somebody didn't approve it, didn't get into the system right. Some piece of the information was missing. And so we just try to get those wrinkles ironed out early so that
makes sense.
So that it runs on clockwork. It doesn't have to be a lot, maybe it's $2,000 or something. Okay, let's talk about how confidence is everything. Wait, before I even go to this slide, I want to tell a quick story. I'd quote you right with confidence. So my other company, Proco, the Proco agency, we represent org effectiveness consultants. We were asked to find a consultant for a medical device company in Silicon Valley. I forget even what the work was, but we had 4 people that could really do this work, done tons of work in this area. And so 3 of them said their rate was, I don't know, $325, $350 an hour or something like that. So 3 of them were in the same area. And then the 4th person said that her rate was $650. And we said, okay, your rate is more than twice as much as any of the other 3 people we're going to pitch. Do you want to lower your rate, or you want to go in with what you're at? She said, nope, that's my rate. I'm sticking with it. I'm not that desperate for the work. $650. I'm like, okay. So we pitch the 4 people to the client. We don't give the rates to the client. We say their rates range from $325 to $650. One of them is at $650, and we're not going to tell you which one because we want you to select the person that's really going to be the best fit for you in your situation. You know where the story's going, of course, that they picked the woman that was $650. And she did not have a stronger pedigree. She did not have McKinsey on her resume. She's strong, but no stronger than the other 3 people. She's making $650 an hour. It's inexplicable. It's confidence. It's the only thing I can attribute it to. She's just like, well, I know what I'm doing. I do it well. I'm $650. And God love you. We got to get the rest of our consultants to think like you. So learn from that story. So here's other tips for getting the rate that you want. This one is in quotes. What fee would give you a heart attack? So Ebony, this is particularly for you. This is from the book from David A. Fields, the consulting guru that I mentioned. He says, you're in the intake meeting, you're asking about their questions, you're asking them why now? And, what's the sense of urgency and blah, blah, blah. And he says that by phrasing it this way, what sort of rate would give you a heart attack? They usually chuckle, adds a bit of levity to a tense conversation. They'll say, oh gosh, well, there's no way we could pay, anywhere near $200,000. I mean, no way. Well, then he knows what the high limit is. And if he comes in anywhere underneath that, at least he'll be reasonable. So I just love that. I just kind of love that approach, particularly when the range is wide and you have no idea. So that might be a good trick for Ebony tomorrow. We already talked about quoting a range, not just one rate. Memorize those words due to this, depending on the scope, duration, and complexity of the work. Consider the urgency. We talked about that. Avoid discounts. It's my policy not to discount rates, or it's our policy. It's the company policy not to discount rates. It makes it seem less personal and less negotiable. When they're like, oh, gee, well, can you cut us a cut us a break on that. No, it's my policy not to discount my rates, but let's look at other ways that we can look at, make the budget work for you. It's just, I don't know, the magic words, it's my policy. That's open for interpretation. And to have a pricing policy, literally you open a Word doc right now, you put at the top of it, my pricing policy, and you put a bullet point, you say, it's my policy not to discount my rate. Boom, done. So you're not even lying. But I love that. It's my policy. Frequently, we win work when we reframe the equation. A lot of times clients will come to us and they're like, oh, we know we need somebody full-time. This is intense change management work. It's going to be at least 40 hours a week. We're thinking, we're like, well, what do what's sort of your ballpark rates? And I'm like, oh, well, the highest we could go is 150 an hour. And we're like, yeah, we don't have anybody at 150 an hour. What if we could get you a really experienced person with 20 years of experience? They're going to charge more, but because they have all the tools and templates and they've done this so many times before, they're not going to need as much handholding. They could probably do it in 2/3 of the time. Even though the rate's higher, we can still honor your budget of $6,000 a week. Would that work for you? Oh, yeah, we hadn't thought about that. That's what I mean by reframing the equation. So then we get somebody in there at $200 an hour who does it in 25 hours a week instead of 40. So it's a little bit like Colorado pricing, but not on such a big scale. And of course, be prepared to explain why consulting rates are so high. Again, for Ebony going into a middle market, small to middle market company, if they freak out or like, oh my God, I had no idea consultants were so expensive. You're like, hey, I'm running a business. I got to pay my own self-employment tax and I have to pay my own health insurance. And that usually dissipates the argument right there. Everybody knows health insurance is exorbitant. All right, so there's a reason this workshop is an hour and a half because look, we already flew through an hour and 25 minutes. So let's talk about additional resources. There's a couple of articles here. There's some upcoming workshops through PICA. Books. This one in particular, which I'm reaching for right now, by Kate Dixon. It's called Name Your Price. Highly recommend it. You see, I got like tape legs all over mine. She and I have the same philosophy, but she gives more examples. And anyway, highly recommend that book by Kate. And of course, my book.
I was just going to say, I was going to do the shameless plug for you.
Oh, thanks, Steve.
Can you read the title?
Yes.
I think this is the key part.
6 keys to taking the leap, winning clients, and building wealth. The building wealth part is important.
It's a good book.
And there's one, thank you, Steve. There's one whole chapter on get the rate you deserve. So there's more info there. Okay. Oh, and we do have a couple of guests here today. Well, one person live, probably one person watching the recording. You paid to take this workshop. If you want to join PICA and get access to all the other materials and templates and office hours and the private LinkedIn community and all that other stuff, use that code workshop 89 when you hit the join now button, and then you'll get the credit. You can only use one code at a time though. So don't like pay for 2 workshops and think that you can combine the codes because that doesn't work. All right, that's it, people. And just enough dialogue and me talking fast enough that we bring it in under the wire. I'm going to stop the recording, but I'm happy to hang out for maybe 5 minutes because then I have to go to another meeting, but happy to answer your questions off the record. And so with that, let me say thanks. We'll get the notes out by end of day tomorrow, and I'll see you guys soon.